Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Joshua Campbell-Torrance, the Executive Director here at the Webb-Deane-Stevens Museum, and welcome to today's Serving Up History. Today, we're going to be exploring the beloved Buttolph-Williams House here in Wethersfield. Museum guide and historic preservationist Bruce Henley will give an overview of the house, including when it was acquired, the murky origins of the structure, the early owners, Frederic Palmer's restoration, the collections, and its connection to the children's book, The Witch of Blackbird Pond. This talk is presented in partnership with Connecticut Landmarks, who, in partnership with the Webb-Deane-Stevens Museum, helps to bring the joy of the house to the public. Bruce is a guide and teacher here at the Webb-Deane-Stevens Museum. He holds music degrees with honor from the Hart School of the University of Hartford, and his private study continued in London and Oxford, England. Bruce has held organist choir master positions in several churches in the greater Hartford area and was a teacher at the Hart School in the community. In addition to his work with us here at the museum, Bruce owns a small antiques business, New England Home Antiques, specializing in early American furniture and period accessories. Thank you for being here, Bruce, and welcome.
Thank you, Joshua. Good afternoon and happy St. Patrick's Day. My talk, as you just heard, is about Buttolph-Williams House. This house is owned by the Connecticut Landmarks, but the tours through the house are provided by the staff here at the Webb-Deane-Stevens Museum. We hope a lot of you will want to come and visit the house after you heard me talk about it. And I want to thank Cindy Riccio for taking a lot of the photographs that are being used to illustrate my talk today. She is the associate director here at our museum. The Buttolph-Williams House was acquired by the Connecticut Landmarks in 1941 under the guidance of Mr. and Mrs. Luke Vincent Lockwood. Restoration of the house didn't begin until 1947, probably due to America's involvement in World War II. It was undertaken under the supervision of the known architectural historian Frederic Palmer. The house opened for the first time to the public in 1951. The origin of the house is shadowy. When it was acquired by the Connecticut Landmarks, it was believed to have been Lieutenant John Buttolph's house, built sometime between 1680 and 92. John actually died in 1692. We know that in 1693, John's son David acquired 2 acres of land where the house currently stands. There was the description of a mansion house on the property, but it seems unlikely that a 25 or 26-year-old man could actually afford to build that kind of a house. The year before, in 1692, the Connecticut River severely flooded. And when restoration work was being done on the house, silt from the river was found in the bottom of the great posts that formed the structure of the house. So could David possibly have purchased a house frame and moved it to his own land? Or possibly could he have moved his father's house to the present site? We don't really know. But what we do know is that the house originally had an L built onto the back of the main structure. Now, if you count the rooms that were in the L, plus those in the main structure, they would correspond to the rooms that were actually listed in the inventory of John Buttolph when he died. All of this, of course, is speculation until further evidence can be brought to light. What we do know is that in 1698, David Buttolph moved to Simsbury, and the property was acquired at that time by Robert Turner for £60. Again, it's described as having a mansion house on 2 acres of land. In 1711, Benjamin Belden bought the property for £70. He was single at the time, and 2 years later, he married. 2 years after that, in 1714, Benjamin was licensed to keep a tavern in the house. So that brings up the question, did Benjamin build a mansion house prior to his marriage? It was obviously standing by 1714, since it was being used as a tavern at that time. Daniel Williams purchased the house and outbuildings and land in 1721 for £245. This suggests that some major improvement had taken place on the land at that time, since the price jumped just 10 years earlier from £70 to £245. The Williams family and their descendants lived in the house for many years. In 1862, James Vibert purchased the house. The Vibert family lived in the house longer than any other. And when Frank, the last of the Viberts, died in 1941, Connecticut Landmarks acquired the house from the Vibert estate. Now, even if the house was built in the early 18th century, it was still built very much in the style of 17th century houses. Although modernized by the Williams during the 18th century into a Georgian-looking house, much of the original work survived, including structural evidence indicating how the exterior of the house originally looked. Most interior woodwork was still in place. It's quite a remarkable survivor from the 17th to early 18th century. The exterior of the house is severe. It has a fortress-like appearance, which is broken up by overhangs delineating each of the levels of floors in the house. So there's a first floor, a second floor, and then the attic. The overhangs had actually been covered up during the Georgian improvements made in the house in the 18th century. The overhangs were only discovered when the Georgian siding was removed from the house, and they discovered not only the overhangs, but original corbels that were part of the framework of the house. The remains of window framing were also in place. The windows were very small. This was because they were trying to preserve warmth in the house during the cold winter months. It does not have anything to do with attacks by Native Americans. The glass was cut into small diamond shapes, and then it's held together with lead strips. And then once the window pane itself was assembled, it was placed in a wooden frame. The house is constructed with posts and beams, and the sheathing on the house is nailed directly to the structure of the house, the underlying structure of the house. At least some of the first floor has bricks in between the structural members. This was a very expensive procedure at the time, and it was done to increase the warmth or insulation of the house. The bricks are clothed with sheathing on the outside and plaster plaster walls on the inside. Again, very expensive work for this at this time period. The house sits directly on a foundation right on the ground. But interior stairs found in the kitchen lead to a root cellar, which was placed underneath the parlor of the house. As the house stands today, it's a 2-over-2 design. That is, there are 2 rooms downstairs and 2 rooms above. There are no windows on the back of the house. This is because of the former L. And again, it has nothing to do with Indian attacks or anything of that sort, nor was it because they were trying to keep the house warmer. It was because there was a structure back there. Entering through the front door, one comes into a small, cramped entryway with the stairs directly in front. And you can see that they're steep and they're curved. Just behind that stairwell, you can see the bricks of a massive center chimney. It's the center chimney which really holds that house together. A door on the left of the narrow hallway leads to the parlor, and a door on the right leads to the great kitchen of the house. The parlor was the most richly furnished room in the house. This was very common. According to Puritan theology, the parlor was supposed to be the most cleanly room in the house. That is, the best room in the house. John Buttolph's 1692 inventory provided the Landmark Society with a guide for the furnishings of the house. And among other items listed in John's parlor, it contained 3 tables, a cupboard, and 11 chairs. Today, the house contains a rare collection of 17th and early 18th century furnishings. In the parlor, there's a quart cupboard, which can be seen at the back of the picture. There's also a sunflower chest, dated 1672, seen on the right side of the pictures. And you can see the great fireplace. Now, when the house was being restored, the moldings and doors in this room were missing. So the moldings around the fireplace and the doors were copied from those in the bedchamber above, which are original to the house. This room was reserved for special use during this early time period. This was a room where special guests would be entertained, perhaps the clergyman, a selectman. It was reserved for weddings and funerals. This is the room where formal courting of young couples would take place. And this is also a room that would have been used for special suppers or parties. When someone died, the funeral would actually take place in this room. Now, much like today, the great kitchen was the hub of a household. This was a multi-purpose room where the family cooked, they dined there, they performed household chores in the space, and in their rare spare time, this is where they would relax by a warm fire in the winter months. The original huge fireplace, cooking fireplace, remained largely intact beneath later modifications. The arch in the back wall of the firebox indicated where the bake oven was located. Half of the oven had collapsed, so it did have to be rebuilt during the restoration. There are dozens of objects in this room which indicate how life was carried out in an early colonial kitchen. We have wooden plates, laundry items, and there are even implements in there for making soap. Upstairs, another narrow hallway leads to 2 chambers on either side. The kitchen chamber is the plainest room in the house. This is most likely where the children slept. And it's probably also the room where guests were put up if they spent the night when the house was functioning as a tavern. It was a space that was too valuable to just be used for sleeping. So this room would have been also a multi-purpose room. Perhaps someone would go up there to study or to write. In the case right now, it's set up as if spinning were going on in this room. So chores were carried out as well as sleeping in this space. The massive framing of the house can also easily be seen in both of these bed chambers. Here we have a good view of the timber frames which form the ceiling in that room. And of course, they are the joists that go to the attic flooring above. The parlor chamber is furnished with a high post bed and hangings. Now, this was a very, very expensive piece of furniture at this early time period. Now, the expense didn't go into the wood or the mattress. The expense went into the making of the hangings that were found on the bed. These hangings could be closed in the cold winter months, keeping the sleepers warmer. But during the warm summer months, they were generally removed from the structure of the bed. There were elegant woodwork features in this room, including the collection moldings around the fireplace and the mantel above it. We know from evidence that actually each one of the 4 fireplaces did have a small mantel above it. Also, the original doors remained in place in this room. In fact, the whole room was in very, very good original condition, and very little restoration had to be done in this room. There had been a plaster ceiling which was added in the 18th century, and the remains of the holes from the nails in the lap can still be seen in some of the beams above. But the actual white wash was still on the ceiling and the beams that had been used when the house was built. So very, very little work had to be done in this room. Back in the hallway between the bed chambers, there is an enclosed set of stairs which leads to the very steeply pitched roof in the attic. It's a very large space. This space was also used for many different functions. It was used for storage, like attics are today. It could be used in the cold winter months for storage of food. It could be used for space where chores might be done. And when it was required, someone could sleep up there as well. Today, the Buttolph-Williams House is visited by many, many school groups and adults who have read The Witch of Blackbird Pond. This children's novel was published in 1958. It was written by Elizabeth George Speare, and it won a Newbery Medal in 1959. It's a really wonderful tool for teaching about early life in America. Its fictional family, the Woods, lived in the Buttolph-Williams House. The heroine of the story is newly arrived from the Caribbean, and she is forced to learn about the hardships of life in early colonial Connecticut. The book uses actual historical figures as well as fictional characters. The plot involves topics such as Puritan views and religious life, colonial work ethics, politics, witchcraft, and romance. In fact, in the story, the heroine is pursued by 2 suitors. Today, the house continues to be used for historical programs. There's a different kind of romance, however, connected to the Buttolph-Williams House. The kind of romance associated with 19th century Romanticism. Visiting this great house evokes emotions of the past and the lives that were lived in the house. It also emits a longing in us for what we imagine to be a simpler and more honest way of life. Now, that is probably not really true, but we like to think of it in those terms. In fact, this remarkable house opens our minds. It provides a unique perspective on the past. It fills our hearts with the dedication, hard work, hardships, and accomplishments of all those who have gone before us and lived not only in that house, but here in Colonial, Connecticut. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Bruce. And we'll open up the discussion now for some questions. I will lead off with a question, and admittedly, it's because I know how much you love this house. So my question for you is twofold. What is your favorite part of the house? And when you take visitors through the house, what do they enjoy the most?
I think the visitors probably most enjoy the great kitchen. They really like the seeing how the room was used, and they really ask a lot of questions about the different objects in the room and how they were used as part of colonial life. There's a lot of questions often about cooking. The soap making implements always draw a lot of interest. The wash tub and how women had to wash in those days. That was a really, really tough job. They're always interested in the wooden plates, things of that sort. So I would say that guests most enjoy the great kitchen. For me, it's probably a toss-up between that room and the parlor. There are just some wonderful objects in the parlor. I especially like early furnishings, so I really like the furniture that's found in that parlor.
Well, it's always fun to kind of think about these spaces and take people through. Of course, you lead people through the other houses as well. Is there something about the house that surprises them when they come in, especially if you've taken them to the other houses?
I think there is. I don't know if I can define what it is. I think there's something about when they go into that small hallway. Our three museum houses are such grand houses, and they have big, big hallways when you step in. Then they get into that little cramped entry hallway, and you get almost a sort of either a little bit of a gasp from them, or you can see them kind of looking around like, I'm not quite sure what I've gotten into in this house. It's a very different experience from our museum.
So there's a question, was slavery active in Connecticut at that time?
Yes. In fact, we know from John Buttolph's 1692 inventory that he actually owned a slave woman. She did not live in his house, however. She lived in an outbuilding on his property.
What's your thought in terms of sort of the history of amassing that collection? If you had to go back and refurnish it now, would you make different choices?
Not very much. It's really amazing how many objects in the house are found in John's inventory. For instance, that huge collection of trine plates. At one time in the inventory, it mentions that in a bedchamber of all places, he had dozens of trineware plates. I'm not quite sure why, possibly because he was a merchant and he was selling them. But there were lots and lots of objects in the house, in his house. And as a guide, when I first started, we used to say that the house was overfurnished. But if you actually study the inventory, the house is not overfurnished. And as I mentioned earlier in the talk, there were 3 tables in the parlor, as well as a cupboard of some kind. And cupboards were very, very expensive pieces of furniture in the 17th and 18th centuries. And John was obviously a man of some means to be able to afford a cupboard. And so with the tables, the cupboard, and 11 chairs, you can see that room was quite well furnished.
So go ahead.
It would be very difficult to make that collection today. There are a lot of rare things in there that would be hard to come by. It would be hard to acquire a sunflower chest in that kind of condition. Finding a cork cupboard like that, they don't come around that much in American cork cupboard. So it would be very difficult to put together that collection today. It would take many, many years to do it.
Now, when we go through the house and we talk about the Witch of Blackbird Pond, what are the most common questions you get about the book and about its association?
One thing I want to say, it's not so much a question, but with especially the younger school kids that have read the book or studying the book when they come, a frequent question that they have is, did the Wood family really live in the house? And I, of course, say, no, these were fictional characters and so on and so forth. But honestly, with some of those kids, I sometimes think when I tell them that, they're going to cry because it seems so real to them. And they can easily imagine a family living in there. And another question that the school kids often ask is, well, who lives in the house now? So to us as adults, without any plumbing and with very little electricity, we can't really see anybody living in there. But there's something about a child's imagination. They can easily see people still living in that house.
Now, would you live in the house now?
I'd want to make a few modifications. I like my indoor plumbing.
Assuming it had indoor plumbing, I'm projecting that it's the kind of house that you would enjoy living in, though.
Yes, I would.
So
I think I'd probably want to put the original, or do a restoration of the L that was on the back.
And actually, good timing. We have a question. Can you speak a little bit more about the L?
I can't speak very much about the L because we don't really know very much about it, or at least no information has come to light on it. What we do know is that there was a second kitchen there in the L. That was probably the one that was mostly used for cooking, and that it contained a relatively rare thing at the time here in Connecticut. It had a fireplace which was in the corner of the room. It was not centered on the wall. We know that there was a storeroom or a buttery there, and probably there was also a small sleeping chamber or perhaps a second storeroom. So we think that the L contained 3 rooms, the kitchen and then 2 smaller rooms.
Well, we have a question about, do Wethersfield school children tour the house? And if so, what grade level?
They do, and we really get all sorts of different grade levels. They come, I would say, from what, 4, 5, 6th grade, and they go right through high school. And we've also had college groups that have come, especially if they're doing material cultural studies.
Well, I want to thank you, Bruce, and I want to thank all of you for participating today. Now, just Bruce, because it is, after all, St. Patrick's Day, and you've got a very sporty bow tie on, but can you lean forward so we can see that great bow tie? There it is. Thank you. And I'll join you with my St. Patrick's Day hat. Thank you all so much for joining and being part of this discussion today. We really have enjoyed your presentation, Bruce, and all of you out there with these great questions. We look forward to seeing you all hopefully next week on March 24th, where you can join us for our final installment of our final slice of Serving Up History. Museum guide and teacher Dan Sterner will explore the history and architecture of Old Hartford. So Thank you so much again, Bruce. Happy St. Patrick's Day to all of you out there, and we'll see you next time on Serving Up History.